Blood tastes a lot like cheap copper coins. Riley learned that undeniable truth at 16. 10 years later, scrubbing down a sticky formica table in a dead-end diner at 3 in the morning, she didn't expect to taste it again, let alone spill it from the mouth of the city's untouchable kingpin. He thought she was just another nameless girl in a grease-stained apron. He laughed. He challenged her. Big mistake. Sometimes the deadliest things in the room are the ones practically blending into the wallpaper. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, erratic pitch that drilled straight into the base of Riley's skull. It was a migraine waiting to happen, compounding the dull, persistent ache radiating up from her arches. She dragged a damp rag across booth number 4, pushing around a puddle of spilled ketchup and coffee rings. The rag smelled like stale bleach and defeat. This late, the diner always smelled like that, a pungent mix of old fryer grease ammonia and the unwashed coats of truck drivers who stopped in for cheap pie. Riley shoved a stray lock of dull blonde hair out of her eyes, leaving a smudge of moisture on her forehead. She was 26, but her joints felt 40. The midnight shift did that to a person. It stripped away the polite veneer of daylight society and left only the raw, exhausted remnants of humanity. A couple of booths over an old man with trembling hands nursed a cup of decaf, staring blankly at the rain sliding down the glass. Behind the counter, Jimmy the line cook scraped down the grill with a heavy metal spatula, the rhythmic shh sound cutting through the quiet. Then the bell above the glass door chimed. It wasn't a cheerful ring. It was sharp. The heavy door groaned open, letting in a sudden, violent draft of November air that bit through Riley's thin cotton uniform. She shivered, pausing mid-wipe. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly. It was a physical sensation, like the air pressure dropping right before a severe thunderstorm. The old man stopped drinking his coffee. Jimmy stopped scraping the grill. Footsteps echoed on the scuffed linoleum. Heavy, deliberate, expensive. Riley straightened up, tossing the rag into the plastic bus tub. 3 men walked in. The 2 on the flanks were built like brick walls, wearing thick leather jackets that couldn't quite hide the bulk of shoulder holsters. But it was the man in the center who commanded the room. He didn't look like a street-level thug. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a tailored suit that probably cost more than Riley made in 2 years. His dark hair was brushed back, straying slightly at the temples, framed by a sharp, unforgiving jawline. He had the kind of face you'd see on a billboard, but his eyes ruined the aesthetic. They were black flat and entirely devoid of warmth. They scanned the greasy spoon with a mixture of boredom and mild disgust, finally settling on the back corner booth, the one shrouded in shadows. Riley recognized him immediately. Anyone who lived on the South Side for more than a month knew who Dominic Russo was. You didn't say his name too loudly. You didn't look too closely at the black SUVs rolling through the neighborhood, and you certainly didn't want him in your place of business. Dominic moved toward the back booth without waiting to be seated. His men slid into the opposite side, scanning the perimeter hands, resting casually near their waists. Riley, the frantic whispered hiss came from the wait station. Riley turned to see Carla, a 19-year-old college student who worked Tuesdays and Thursdays, plastered against the wall by the coffee machines. Carla's face was the color of skim milk. Her hands were shaking so hard the menus she held were vibrating. "I can't go over there." Carla choked out her voice, barely audible over the hum of the fridge. "That's him. That's Russo. My cousin owed one of his guys money and they broke his jaw in 3 places. I can't." Riley let out a slow, measured breath through her nose. She looked at Carla's terrified, watery eyes, then back at the men in the booth. Every instinct, Riley had instincts honed by a childhood, spent dodging heavy hands, and an adolescence spent surviving the foster system screamed at her to walk out the back door and keep walking, but she had rent due on Tuesday. The eviction notice was already drafted. The landlord had told her as much. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She couldn't afford to be scared, or at least she couldn't afford to show it. "Fine, give me the pad," Riley said, her voice gravelly and flat. She snatched the order pad and a cheap ballpoint pen from Carla's trembling fingers. She didn't bother smoothing her apron or pasting on a customer service smile. There was no point. Men like Dominic Russo didn't care about smiles. They saw them as weakness. As Riley walked toward the back of the diner, the scent of the room changed. The grease and bleach were suddenly overpowered by the smell of crisp winter rain leather and a very subtle sharp cologne, something like cedar and black pepper. It made her stomach tighten, a primal response to an apex predator entering the territory. She stopped at the edge of the table. Up close, Dominic looked even more exhausted, though the tension coiled in his shoulders suggested he was entirely awake. He was tracing the edge of a water stain on the table with a long, unblemished finger. He didn't look up. "What can I get you?" Riley asked. She kept her tone neutral, bordering on bored. One of the bodyguards, a thick-necked man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, sneered. "Show some respect, sir." Riley shifted her weight, feeling the familiar twinge in her lower back. She looked directly at the bodyguard. "The menu's on the wall. The coffee's fresh. I can call him whatever you want. But it doesn't change the fact that we're out of cherry pie." The bodyguard's face darkened, his thick fingers twitching on the tabletop. He started to half-rise from the vinyl seat. "You smart-mouthed little—" Dominic raised a single hand. 2 fingers lifted just an inch off the table. The bodyguard froze, snapping his jaw shut, and sank back down into the booth. The obedience was terrifying. It wasn't born of respect. It was born of absolute fear. Finally, Dominic lifted his head. His dark eyes locked onto Riley. The temperature in her veins seemed to drop a few degrees. He looked at her chipped fingernails, the faded name tag pinned crookedly to her chest, and the dark circles under her eyes. It was a thoroughly dismissive appraisal. "Black coffee," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "3 of them. Bring a clean pot." "Sure," Riley muttered, turning on her heel. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands thankfully remained steady as she walked back toward the counter. Pouring the coffee was a mechanical action. Grab the pot with the orange rim. Decaf was brown, regular was orange. Grab 3 heavy ceramic mugs. Wipe the rims. Riley's mind was a static buzz. She could feel the weight of their stares burning into her spine from across the room. She hated that feeling. It made the old scars on her knuckles itch. It made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. When she returned to the table, the men were speaking in low, rapid Italian. They stopped the second her sneakers squeaked on the linoleum next to the booth. Riley set the mugs down. 1, 2, 3. She didn't spill a drop. She reached across the table to place the last mug in front of the bodyguard with the scar. As she pulled her arm back, the man's massive hand shot out his fingers, clamping shut around her wrist like a steel vice. Riley went perfectly still. The coffee pot in her free hand tipped slightly, the scalding liquid inside, swaying dangerously close to the rim. "I don't like your attitude," the bodyguard murmured, his grip tightening. It wasn't a gentle hold. He was pressing his thumb directly into the tendon, trying to elicit a flinch. "You need to learn how to talk to your betters, sweetheart." Pain flared up Riley's forearm, hot and sharp. She didn't gasp. She didn't try to jerk her arm away. Pulling back would only give him leverage. Instead, she stared down at his thick, calloused hand, her jaw clenching so tight her teeth ached. "Let go of me," Riley said. The words came out terrifyingly calm, devoid of the panic he was clearly looking for. The bodyguard chuckled, looking at Dominic for approval. "She's giving orders now." Dominic leaned back against the vinyl seat, resting his elbows on the backrest. He looked mildly amused, as if he were watching a stray cat try to hiss at a Rottweiler. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, his dark eyes fixed on Riley's face. He was looking for the crack. He was waiting for the tears, the apology, the begging. "You got a mouth on you, Waitress," Dominic said, his tone dripping with condescension. He set the mug down with a soft click. "You think you're tough? Coming at my men in a place like this?" He let out a short, rough laugh that scraped against the silence of the diner. It was a mocking, arrogant sound. "Prove it," something inside Riley snapped. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the quiet, definitive click of a safety being turned off. 10 years of swallowing her pride, 10 years of looking at the floor while men with heavy hands took what they wanted, 10 years of exhaustion and cheap copper pennies. It all culminated in that single dismissive laugh. She didn't think. The muscle memory took over hardwired into her bones from back-alley scraps and a youth spent fighting for scraps of dignity. She didn't pull away from the bodyguard's grip. Instead, she stepped into him. Using his own force against him, Riley twisted her wrist sharply against his thumb joint, the weakest point of the human grip. As his hold broke with a surprised grunt, she slammed the heavy glass bottom of the hot coffee pot directly onto the center of his hand, pinning it to the table. He roared, trying to yank his hand back, but Riley had already pivoted. The second bodyguard lunged across the table. Riley caught a handful of his thick leather jacket and used his forward momentum to slam his face down into the hard edge of the formica table. The sickening crunch of cartilage echoed loudly, followed by a spray of bright crimson. He slumped back, groaning hands clutching his broken nose. It took less than 3 seconds. Dominic didn't have time to draw a weapon. He barely had time to blink before Riley bypassed the table entirely. She kicked the heavy wooden chair beside the booth, sending it sliding violently into his shins. As Dominic instinctively dropped his hands to block, Riley grabbed a fistful of his expensive wool lapels. She didn't try to punch him. He was twice her weight and built like a tank. Instead, she dropped her center of gravity, hooked her right leg behind his knee, and violently twisted her torso, using her entire body weight as leverage. The physics of it were undeniable. The center of balance shifted. Dominic Russo, the untouchable boss of the South Side, went airborne. He hit the scuffed linoleum floor with a concussive thud that rattled the napkin dispensers. All the air left his lungs in a rushed, violent huff. The back of his head bounced once against the cold tile. Silence slammed down over the diner. It was deafening. Jimmy had stopped the grill scraper. The old man in the corner had dropped his fork. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop humming. Riley stood over him, her chest heaving, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her apron was twisted. A single drop of blood from the second bodyguard's nose had splattered onto her white collar. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the massive, toxic dump of adrenaline flooding her system. The smell of the spilled coffee, mixing with the heavy scent of Dominic's cologne, was nauseating. She looked down at the man on the floor. Dominic was staring up at her wide-eyed, struggling to draw oxygen back into his lungs. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone. "I'm not tough," Riley rasped her voice, trembling slightly, as the terrifying reality of what she had just done washed over her like ice water. She looked at the two bodyguards, one nursing a potentially broken hand, the other bleeding profusely from the face, both now reaching frantically for their coats. "I'm just really tired of taking out the trash," Dominic coughed, holding up a hand to stop his men from drawing their weapons. He didn't look furious. He didn't look humiliated. As he dragged a breath into his battered lungs, he looked up at the cheap, flickering lights, and then back at the exhausted waitress, towering over him, and very softly he smiled. Dominic didn't rush to stand. He stayed on the scuffed linoleum for a long, agonizing moment, letting the erratic hum of the fluorescent lights wash over him. He tested the bruised muscles in his back with a slight shift of his shoulders, then rolled onto his side. His men were practically vibrating with violent, intent hands hovering over their holsters, but a sharp, upward flick of Dominic's wrist kept them frozen. Riley backed away, putting a solid 3 feet between herself and the man on the floor. The adrenaline crash was hitting her now hard and fast. Her knees felt like they were filled with wet sand. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across her collarbones, making the thin cotton of her uniform stick uncomfortably to her skin. Her stomach churned a sour mixture of fear and leftover coffee threatening to rise in her throat. She gripped the edge of the adjacent booth to keep her hands from trembling visibly. Bracing a hand on the table leg, Dominic pushed himself up. He dusted off the knees of his charcoal trousers with meticulous, agonizingly slow care. The bodyguard with the broken nose was bleeding profusely onto a stack of paper napkins, his breathing wet and ragged. The other was glaring at Riley with a look that promised a shallow grave. Dominic adjusted his lapels. He didn't look at his men. He looked at Riley. The flat, dead expression from earlier was gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating intensity that made Riley want to sink through the floorboards. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a puzzle piece that didn't belong in the box. He reached into his inner coat pocket. Riley flinched, her muscles locking up, expecting cold steel. Instead, Dominic pulled out a slim silver money clip. He peeled off 3 crisp, unwrinkled $100 bills and dropped them onto the table, right next to the puddle of spilled coffee. "For the mess," Dominic said. His voice was entirely steady, lacking the breathlessness from just a minute prior. He glanced at the broken chair, then back to her face. "And the entertainment?" He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the glass doors, his stride perfectly even, betraying no sign of the hard landing he'd just taken. His men scrambled to follow the bleeding one, leaving a trail of red droplets on the floor. The bell chimed sharply as the door closed. Silence swallowed the diner again, heavier this time. Riley Wahutor. Jimmy breathed from the grill line. He walked out from behind the counter, a greasy spatula hanging limply from his hand. He looked at the empty booth, then at the $300, then at her. He looked like he was attending a funeral. "You're dead. You know that, right? You just signed your own death certificate." "Shut up, Jimmy," Riley snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She scrubbed a shaking hand over her face, pressing the heels of her palms into her eyes until sparks danced in the darkness. "Just grab a mop. Please." The rest of the shift was a blur of paranoid agony. Every time a car drove past the rain-streaked windows, Riley's heart slammed against her ribs. Every rattle of the plumbing sounded like a slide racking back. She wiped down tables with mechanical inefficiency, her mind looping the 3 seconds of violence over and over. She had lost control. 10 years of keeping her head down, of swallowing bile, and smiling through gritted teeth ruined because she couldn't take one more heavy hand on her wrist. At 6 a.m. the sun dragged itself over the city skyline, a sickly pale grey light bleeding through the heavy cloud cover. Riley clocked out. She changed out of her uniform in the cramped, mildew-smelling bathroom, pulling on a faded, oversized sweater and a denim jacket that did nothing against the November chill. She shoved the $300 deep into her jeans pocket. It felt radioactive against her thigh. Stepping out of the diner's back exit into the alley, the cold air hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of wet asphalt, rotting cardboard, and exhaust fumes. She pulled her collar up, keeping to the shadows. The walk to her apartment was usually a 20-minute trudge through a neighborhood most people avoided in broad daylight. Today it felt like walking across a minefield. She kept her chin-tucked eyes tracking the reflections in the greasy puddles. A black sedan idled at the corner of 4th and Elm. Riley stopped, her breath catching in her throat, pluming in the freezing air. She stood perfectly still, behind a rusted dumpster, waiting. A woman with a tired face got out of the sedan, dragging a screaming toddler by the hand. Just a mother coming home from a night shift. Riley let out a shaky exhale, her shoulders dropping an inch. She was losing her mind. Men like Dominic Russo didn't send hit squads in the morning. They operated in the dark. They took their time. By the time she reached her building, a crumbling brick brutalist structure with a broken buzzer and a front door that didn't latch her boots was soaked through. She climbed the 5 flights of stairs, the sour smell of boiled cabbage and old cigarettes lingering in the stairwell. She unlocked her door, throwing 3 separate deadbolts, and collapsed against the cheap wood. She was exhausted down to her marrow, but as she stared at the peeling wallpaper of her cramped living room, she knew sleep wasn't going to come. The radiator in the corner hissed and clanked, a dying mechanical lung fighting for air. Riley lay on her lumpy mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that vaguely resembled a crushed skull. It was 2 p.m. She had managed maybe 3 hours of jagged, nightmare-fueled sleep. Her knuckles ached. Her lower back was a knot of tight, burning muscle. She rolled over, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. The $300 bill sat on her battered nightstand, weighing down a stack of past-due utility bills. It was exactly enough to cover the rent she was short on. It was a lifeline. It was also blood money dropped by a man who could erase her existence with a single phone call. She couldn't stay in the apartment. The walls felt like they were inching closer together, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of her own heart. If she stayed in this box, she would suffocate on her own panic. She needed to do something normal. Grounding. Hauling herself out of bed, Riley gathered her meager pile of dirty clothes, shoving them into a cracked plastic laundry basket. She grabbed her keys and the small jar of quarters she kept by the sink. Normal. She would just do normal things. The neighborhood laundromat was 3 blocks away, a depressing fluorescent-lit cavern sandwiched between a boarded-up liquor store and a pawn shop. It smelled overwhelmingly of artificial floral detergent and ozone. A row of washing machines churned rhythmically, a comforting, steady noise that dulled the ringing in Riley's ears. The place was mostly empty. An elderly woman sat in the corner, asleep over a crossword puzzle. Riley loaded her clothes into a machine near the back, pouring in a capful of cheap detergent. She slammed the metal door shut, fed the quarters into the slot, and leaned her forehead against the cool glass as the water started to fill. The rhythmic sloshing was hypnotic. For a brief, blissful minute, she let her eyes close, letting the mundane reality of laundry day push the image of Dominic Russo's flat black eyes out of her head. You favor your left leg when you walk. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the hum of the washing machines like a straight razor. Riley's eyes snapped open. Her entire body went rigid. The scent of cheap detergent was suddenly overpowered by that familiar, sharp smell, cedar and black pepper. She turned slowly. Dominic was leaning against the row of folding tables directly across from her. He looked entirely out of place in the dingy laundromat. He wasn't wearing the suit from the night before. Instead, he wore a thick, dark navy turtleneck and a tailored black overcoat that probably cost more than the building they were standing in. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets. There was a faint purple bruise flowering along his jawline, right where she had slammed him into the floor tiles. Riley didn't speak. Her throat was bone dry. She looked toward the front door. A massive man in a dark jacket, not one of the 2 from the diner, was standing outside, blocking the exit, pretending to look at his phone. Old injury, Dominic asked, tilting his head slightly, his dark eyes analyzing her posture. Or just tired? What do you want? Riley forced the words out. They sounded harsh, scraped raw by fear, but they didn't tremble. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He looked around the laundromat with a vague expression of distaste, taking in the cracked linoleum and the flickering overhead light. I was curious, Dominic said, finally turning his attention back to her. It's not every day a waitress in a dead-end diner drops a man twice her size with a textbook judo sweep. It takes years to learn how to manipulate a center of gravity like that. He took a slow step forward. Riley instinctively took a step back, her spine hitting the vibrating metal of the washing machine. So I made a phone call. He continued, his voice, a low, smooth cadence that sent a shiver down her spine. Riley Mercer grew up in the foster system, bounced around group homes in the Rust Belt, arrested twice for assault. When you were 18, both charges dropped because the men you put in the hospital refused to testify. Then you drop off the map. You show up here keeping your head down, pouring coffee for minimum wage. Riley's breath caught. He had unspooled her entire life in less than 12 hours. The violation felt physical, a cold hand reaching into her chest. You don't know anything about me. She snarled, the fear suddenly flashing into hot defensive anger. She hated that he knew her last name. She hated that he knew about the arrests. I know you're wasting your talents, Dominic said softly. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint stubble shadowing his bruised jaw. I don't have talents, Riley shot back, gripping the edge of the washing machine behind her. I have a temper, and your guy put his hands on me. That's it. I'm not a hitman. I'm not a thug. I just want to be left alone. Dominic let out a low, rough chuckle. It wasn't mocking this time. It was genuinely amused. Nobody who hits like you do just wants to be left alone, Riley. You're hiding, and you're doing a terrible job of it. He pulled one hand out of his pocket. Between his fingers he held a sleek black card. He reached out, not touching her, and slid the card under the edge of her laundry basket, resting on the adjacent machine. I have a problem, Dominic said, the amusement draining from his face, replaced by that cold, calculating stare. I have a lot of men who know how to pull triggers, but very few who know how to think under pressure. You embarrassed my security detail last night, which means I need better security. Riley stared at him, her mind failing to process the words. You're out of your mind. I broke your guy's nose. I dropped you on your head. Dominic leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Exactly. You didn't hesitate. You didn't care who I was. I need someone who isn't afraid of me. He looked at her bruised knuckles, then up to her exhausted, bloodshot eyes. The diner pays you, what, $400 a week. Work for me, and I'll pay you 10 times that. And you won't ever have to worry about making rent in this dump again. He stepped back, turning toward the door. Think about it, Riley. There's a number on the card. Or don't. But if you stay here, someone else you pissed off in your past is eventually going to find you, and they won't be as polite as I am. Rain turned to sleet by nightfall, coating the cracked sidewalks in a dangerous, slick glaze. Riley walked back to the diner with her chin tucked against her chest, the thin denim of her jacket doing absolutely nothing to block the freezing dampness. The heavy matte black card felt like a cinder block in her pocket. It was a ridiculous proposition. Men like Dominic Russo didn't hire waitresses to guard their backs. They chewed people up and spat them out when they were no longer useful. She knew exactly what that card was, a leash. A very expensive, velvet-lined leash. When she pushed through the glass doors of the diner, the atmosphere was suffocating. Carla had called in sick. Jimmy wouldn't even look at Riley. He kept his eyes glued to the sizzling griddle aggressively flipping burgers that didn't need flipping. The regular customers, the truck drivers and the insomniacs, seemed to intuitively sense the radioactive energy radiating off her. They left exact change and hurried out, avoiding her section entirely. It was isolation in its purest form. She was a pariah. By defending herself, she had marked the diner, and everyone inside it knew it. At 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. Riley's stomach dropped into her cheap sneakers. She turned around, gripping a heavy ceramic coffee mug tightly enough to turn her knuckles white, half expecting to see men in tailored coats walking in with suppressed pistols. Instead, it was Frank. Her landlord was a heavy-set man who smelled permanently of sour beer, cheap cigars, and unwashed hair. He wiped his muddy boots on the welcome mat, his small, watery eyes scanning the empty booths until they locked onto her. Riley set the mug down. Her jaw locked. Frank didn't come to the diner unless he wanted something, and rent wasn't due for another 4 days. "Frank," Riley said, keeping the counter between them. "We're out of the meatloaf." Frank didn't laugh. He walked up to the laminate counter, planting his thick, calloused hands flat on the surface. "I don't want meatloaf, Riley. I want to talk about my property. Rent is due Tuesday. I have it." She thought of the $300 sitting on her nightstand, Dominic's blood money. It tasted like ash in her mouth, just thinking about it. "This ain't about Tuesday," Frank grunted, leaning forward. His breath washed over her, thick and nauseating. "Word travels fast on the south side. Heard you caused a scene in here last night. Heard you made a mess of some very important people." Riley stared at him, her face completely blank. She didn't confirm or deny it. She just let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill it. "Those people," Frank continued, dropping his voice, "they don't just get mad, they get even. And when they get even, they don't care if they burn down the building the person is sleeping in. My building." He tapped a dirty fingernail against the counter. "You're a liability, Riley. My insurance barely covers a grease fire, let alone a Molotov cocktail through a ground floor window. I haven't brought any trouble to your building." She kept her voice dead level. "Not yet." Frank straightened up, crossing his arms over his protruding stomach. "You got until tomorrow noon to pack your trash and leave. I'm changing the locks at 1. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked behind her ribs. "You can't do that. You have to give me a 30-day eviction notice. It's the law." Frank barked out a harsh, ugly laugh. "The law, girl, you just put hands on Dominic Russo. The law doesn't exist for you anymore. You're a walking corpse. I'm not letting you rot in my hallway. Noon tomorrow, or I throw your crap in the alley myself." He turned and lumbered out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving the bell ringing violently. Riley stood perfectly still. The neon sign outside buzzed, casting harsh red light across the empty tables. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking again, but not from adrenaline. It was sheer, overwhelming exhaustion. She had fought her entire life, fought the foster parents who locked the pantry, fought the creeps in the alleyways, fought for every single dollar, every scrap of food, every ounce of dignity. And for what, to be thrown onto the street because she refused to let a thug break her wrist. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the matte black card. Right and wrong were luxuries for people who had savings accounts and secure deadbolts. Out here there was only survival. Dominic Russo was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who paid well. And right now Riley was staring down the barrel of homelessness in the middle of November. She pulled the card out. There was no name, no logo, just a 10-digit phone number stamped in silver foil. Jimmy. Riley called out, her voice echoing in the hollow diner. The cook peeked around the stainless steel exhaust hood, his eyes wide. "Yeah, I'm taking my break." She didn't wait for his permission. She walked into the back alley, pulled her cheap, cracked smartphone from her back pocket, and punched in the numbers. The cold air burned her lungs. The phone rang twice before a smooth, automated-sounding voice picked up. "Yes, it's Riley," she said to the dark alleyway. "I need an address." Morning traffic was a loud, crawling nightmare of blaring horns and diesel exhaust. Riley sat in the back of a pristine black town car, her thigh pressed against the leather door panel. An hour after she made the call, the car had pulled up directly in front of her apartment building. She had thrown her meager belongings into 2 duffel bags, leaving the lumpy mattress and the $300 exactly where they were. Let Frank keep the cash. It was the price of severing her last tie to a normal life. The driver hadn't spoken a single word. He navigated the heavy city traffic with aggressive precision, eventually pulling into the underground parking garage of a massive glass and steel high-rise downtown. It wasn't a smoky basement club or a crumbling warehouse. It was corporate. It was clean. The car stopped. The driver unlocked the doors with a soft click, but didn't look back. Riley grabbed her largest duffel bag, slung the other over her shoulder, and stepped out. The air in the garage smelled of hot brake pads and expensive wax. A man in a tailored grey suit was waiting by the elevator banks. He had the thick neck and squared shoulders of a fighter, but he wore a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that softened his features. "Miss Mercer," he said, giving a brief professional nod. "I'm Leo. Mr. Russo is expecting you on the 42nd floor." Riley didn't return the nod. She gripped the canvas strap of her bag, her knuckles white. "Do I need to be searched?" Leo's lips twitched upward in a microscopic smile. "Mr. Russo explicitly said not to bother. He assumes if you wanted to kill him, you would have done it with the coffee pot." He swiped a keycard, and the polished steel elevator doors slid open silently. The ride up was agonizingly fast, making Riley's ears pop. She looked at her reflection in the mirrored doors. She looked entirely out of place. Faded jeans, scuffed combat boots, and a grey sweater that was unraveling at the cuffs. She looked like a stray dog being dragged into a show ring. The doors opened with a soft chime. The 42nd floor wasn't an office. It was a sprawling, open-concept penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline, the grey clouds hanging low over the concrete canyons. The floors were dark, polished hardwood, deadening the sound of their footsteps. It smelled like fresh rain espresso and that same sharp cedar cologne. Leo led her past a massive minimalist kitchen and into a sunken living area. Dominic was sitting at a massive slab of a concrete dining table, surrounded by open laptop stacks of manila folders and 2 men speaking in hushed, rapid Italian. He looked up as she approached. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a network of faded scars and dark ink that snaked under the fabric. The bruise on his jaw was darker today, a stark purple against his olive skin. He held up a hand. The 2 men immediately stopped talking, gathered their folders and walked past Riley without giving her a second glance. Leo took her duffel bags, setting them quietly by the nearest leather sofa, before retreating to the elevator banks. "You didn't sleep," Dominic observed, leaning back in his chair. "It wasn't a question. I was busy packing," Riley replied, her voice rough. She didn't move closer to the table. She stood her ground at the edge of the sunken room. "You offered me a job. I'm here to find out what the catch is." Dominic picked up a sleek black pen, tapping it rhythmically against a folder. "No catch, Riley. I meant exactly what I said in the laundromat. My current security detail is heavily reliant on intimidation. They're big, they're loud, and they look like thugs." He gestured toward the window. "But the people I deal with now aren't intimidated by broken noses. They operate in boardrooms. I need someone who doesn't look like a threat until it's far too late. So I'm a prop, Riley crossed her arms, her fingernails digging into the sleeves of her sweater. You want a guard dog that fits in a purse. Dominic let out a low laugh, tossing the pen onto the concrete table. If I wanted a lapdog, I'd buy one. I want someone who can read a room. You saw my men coming into that diner before the door even fully opened. You assessed their weapons, their posture, and their sight lines before I even sat down. I watched you do it. Riley tightened her jaw. He wasn't wrong. Hypervigilance was a survival trait she had perfected at 12 years old. You always knew where the exits were, and you always knew who had the heaviest hands in the room. What exactly does the job entail? She asked, her tone flat. Am I breaking legs for you because I don't collect debts? I have plenty of people to collect debts, Dominic said smoothly. He stood up, walking around the large table. He moved with a terrifying grace, completely silent on the hardwood floors. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Your job is to stay close to me. You watch the people I speak to. You watch their hands. You watch the doors. If someone tries to touch me, you drop them exactly like you dropped me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of bills banded in white paper. He held it out to her. 10,000, a signing bonus. Buy some clothes that don't look like they were pulled out of a donation bin. Leo will show you to your room down the hall. Riley stared at the money. It was more cash than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to buy her way out of the city entirely. But as she looked from the banded stack up to Dominic's calculating eyes, she realized the truth. This wasn't an escape. She had just traded a leaky apartment and a minimum wage grinder for a gilded cage. She reached out and took the money, the paper rough against her calloused fingertips. She didn't say thank you. She just looked him dead in the eye. If one of your guys touches me again, Riley said, her voice dropping an octave, I won't use a coffee pot next time. Dominic's smile was slow, sharp, and entirely dangerous. I'm counting on it. Silk lining felt like ice against her skin. Riley stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her assigned bedroom, staring at a stranger. The $10,000 hadn't gone toward a designer wardrobe or flashy jewelry. Leo had escorted her to a private tailor who operated out of a heavily guarded brownstone. Now she wore a pair of charcoal slacks that allowed for a full range of motion, a black high-necked blouse that hid the bruises blooming along her collarbones, and a tailored blazer cut specifically to conceal the weight of a shoulder holster. She hated it. It felt like a costume. The fabric was too clean, the cut too precise. It lacked the comforting, worn-in give of her cheap denim. But as she adjusted the cuffs, she couldn't deny the physiological shift it caused. People didn't look at a woman in a suit like this and see a target. They saw a wall, a sharp knock rapped against the heavy oak door. 5 minutes, Mercer! Leo's voice was muffled through the wood. Riley grabbed a matte black earpiece from the marble dresser, fitting it snugly into her left ear. She traced the wire down her neck, clipping the radio to the waistband of her slacks. It was her 3rd day in the penthouse. She hadn't seen the street since she arrived. Her days had been an exhausting, bruising blur of training in the building's subterranean gym. Leo didn't teach her how to fight. He quickly realized the streets had already done that, but he taught her how to fight clean. No biting, no gouging, no improvised weapons unless absolutely necessary. He taught her how to secure a room, how to identify exits in 3 seconds, and how to spot a concealed weapon beneath a jacket. She walked out into the massive living area. The skyline beyond the glass was a bruised twilight purple. Dominic was waiting by the elevator. He wore a midnight blue suit that seemed to absorb the light, a silver tie clip, the only flash of metal on him. He was scrolling through a tablet, his face an unreadable mask of cold calculation. He didn't look up as she approached. Your left shoulder is stiff. Riley stopped a respectful 2 feet behind him. Leo throws a heavy right hook. I didn't slip fast enough yesterday. If it had been a knife, you'd be bleeding out on the mats, Dominic said, finally glancing over his shoulder. His dark eyes swept over her new attire, lingering for a fraction of a second on the tailored fit of her blazer before snapping back to her face. Pain is a teacher, Riley. Learn the lesson, or you won't last the month. I learn fast, she shot back, keeping her tone flat. Dominic's jaw twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him in 3 days. We'll see. Tonight is a sit-down. No active hostilities, but tensions are high. You stay on my right side. You don't speak unless spoken to by me. You watch the hands. You watch the mirrors. If things go sideways, your only priority is getting me to the freight elevator. You don't engage to win. You engage to extract. Understand. Engage to extract. Got it. The elevator doors chimed and parted. They stepped inside the heavy silence of the descent, pressing against Riley's eardrums. The air between them was constantly charged, a thick, uncomfortable friction that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Dominic wasn't like the thugs she had grown up fighting. He didn't brag. He didn't threaten loudly. His violence was a quiet, suffocating pressure, always present, always waiting to be unleashed. And she was now a part of it. The realization made her stomach twist with a sickening blend of guilt and a terrifying, undeniable thrill. The town car was waiting in the garage. As they slid into the back seat, the smell of expensive leather and Dominic's sharp cedar cologne enveloped her. It was intoxicating and dangerous. "Who are we meeting?" Riley asked, staring out the tinted window as the car merged onto the rain-slicked avenue. "An associate named Carmine," Dominic replied, his voice barely rising above the hum of the tires. "He controls the shipping yards on the east side. He's been skimming off the manifests for 6 months. He thinks I don't know." Riley turned to look at him. "And you're just going to have dinner with him? Civilized men break bread before they break bones." "Riley." Dominic said, his gaze fixed on the blurred city lights. "It gives them a false sense of security. It makes them arrogant. And arrogant men make mistakes." She studied his profile, the sharp jaw, the straight nose, the absolute lack of tension in his shoulders. He was walking into a room with a man he intended to ruin, and his pulse probably hadn't risen a single beat. It was monstrous. "What happens when he makes a mistake?" she asked quietly. Dominic turned his head slowly, his black eyes locking onto hers in the dim light of the back seat. "That depends entirely on how badly you want to earn your signing bonus." A cold shiver snaked down Riley's spine. She broke eye contact first, looking back out at the glowing red taillights of the traffic ahead. The leather holster pressed heavily against her ribs. She took a slow, deep breath, tasting the faint, metallic tang of adrenaline in the back of her throat. Cigar smoke hung in the air of the private dining room like a toxic grey curtain. It smelled of roasted meat, aged bourbon, and sweat, trying desperately to hide behind expensive cologne. Riley stood perfectly still in the corner, her back against the damask-patterned wallpaper. The room was soundproofed, severing them from the clatter of the high-end steakhouse outside. Dominic sat at the head of a long mahogany table, nursing a glass of scotch. Carmine sat opposite him. Carmine was a heavy man with a florid face and a nervous tic that made him constantly dab at his upper lip with a linen napkin. Behind Carmine stood 2 men, large, thick-necked, and radiating aggressive incompetence. They were glaring at Leo, who stood by the door, and at Riley. Riley ignored them. She watched the reflections in the polished silver serving covers resting on the sideboy. She watched the subtle shifting of weight under Carmine's custom suit. "It's a misunderstanding, Dominic, I swear to God," Carmine said, his voice a gravelly whine. He leaned forward, gesturing with a fat, ring-covered hand. The manifest was shorted at the port of origin. I had my guys tear the warehouse apart. The crates weren't there. $3 million worth of electronics doesn't just evaporate, Carmine, Dominic replied smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He took a slow sip of his scotch. And yet my accountants found a very interesting sudden influx of cash in your brother-in-law's shell company. Exactly $3 million minus laundering fees. Carmine's face flushed a deeper shade of red. The heavy thud of his heart was practically audible in the quiet room. You accusing me of something, because I've been loyal for 10 years. You don't disrespect me in front of my own men. I respect loyalty. Dominic set the heavy crystal glass down on the wood. Clack. I do not respect theft, and I certainly do not respect being lied to. The atmosphere snapped. The air pressure dropped violently. Carmine slammed his fist on the table, the silverware jumping with a sharp rattle. I ain't taking this from you. You think you can just march in here? As Carmine shouted, the guard directly behind his right shoulder made his move. It was telegraphed miles away. His shoulder dipped his right hand, sweeping back toward the bulge beneath his suit jacket. He was fast, but he was panicked. Riley was already moving. She didn't run. She crossed the thick Persian rug in 3 long, silent strides, a ghost in a tailored suit. She didn't draw the weapon from her shoulder holster. A gunshot in this enclosed space would be deafening and messy. Before the guard's hand could fully clear his jacket, Riley slammed the heel of her palm directly into the nerve cluster where his neck met his collarbone. The brachial stun was textbook. The guard's eyes rolled back, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as his entire right arm went completely numb, dropping uselessly to his side. As he staggered backward, Riley grabbed his tie, using his own shifting weight against him, and swept his lead leg. He hit the carpeted floor with a muffled, heavy thud. Before the second guard could even process what was happening, Riley had her knee planted firmly into the downed man's sternum, her left hand pinning his wrist, her right hand holding a sleek, black, ceramic folding knife, drawn from a concealed pocket, pressed gently against the second guard's femoral artery through his trousers. Silence slammed back into the room. Carmine had frozen mid-rant, his mouth hanging open. He looked down at his best enforcer, who was gasping for air under the knee of a woman who looked like she barely weighed 130 pounds. Riley didn't look at the men she had subdued. Her breathing was perfectly even. She looked directly at Carmine, her eyes flat and dead. Sit back down. Carmine swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. He slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Dominic hadn't flinched. He hadn't spilled a drop of his scotch. He looked at the scene before him, and a slow, dark satisfaction spread across his features. It was the look of a man who had gambled heavily and won. As I was saying, Dominic continued, his voice echoing in the terrified silence. You will wire the $3 million plus 20% interest for the inconvenience into my account by morning. Then you will step down from the shipping yards entirely. If I see your face on the east side again, Miss Mercer here will be less accommodating. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Enjoy the steak, Carmine. Dominic turned and walked toward the door. Leo opened it, stepping out into the hallway. Riley held her position for a fraction of a second longer, letting the cold edge of the ceramic blade press just enough to serve as a final warning. Then, in one fluid motion, she stood, collapsed the knife, and slipped it away. She didn't look back as she followed Dominic out of the room. The walk back to the car was silent. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. Riley expected the familiar crash, the shaking hands, the nauseating guilt. But as she slid into the back of the town car, Taking her place beside the city's most dangerous man, her hands were perfectly steady. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was the danger. And heaven help her, she liked it. Midnight brought a heavy driving rain that lashed against the reinforced glass of the penthouse. It sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the windows. Riley stood in the center of her stark, spotless bathroom, staring at the stranger in the vanity mirror. She stripped off the shoulder holster, letting the heavy leather and steel drop onto the marble counter with a dull, heavy clank. Without the jacket, the bruises from Leo's training sessions were violently visible against her pale skin. Purples, sickly yellows, and deep, mottled blacks bloomed across her ribs and collarbones. She turned on the faucet, letting the freezing water run over her hands. The tremor had finally arrived. It started in her wrists and radiated up to her elbows. It wasn't the frantic, suffocating shaking of a panic attack. It was the jagged electric aftermath of a live wire suddenly losing its current. She had nearly severed a man's artery tonight. She had watched his eyes roll back, felt the heavy, dead weight of his body collapse under her knee, and she hadn't felt a single drop of pity. Riley scooped the freezing water onto her face, gasping as the icy shock hit her skin. She grabbed a thick cotton towel, burying her face in it. It smelled of heavy bleach and industrial starch. A hotel smell. A temporary smell. When she walked out into the main living area, the lights were entirely killed, save for the ambient, bruised purple glow of the city filtering through the rain-streaked glass. The penthouse was freezing. Dominic was standing by the windows, a dark silhouette against the skyline. He had shed his suit jacket and unfastened the top 2 buttons of his collar. 2 heavy crystal tumblers sat on the massive concrete table. Riley walked over her bare feet, entirely silent on the hardwood. She stopped at the edge of the table, looking at the glasses. 2 fingers of dark amber liquid over a single perfectly spherical ice cube. "I didn't peg you for a bourbon drinker," Dominic said, his voice a low, rough rasp in the quiet room. He didn't turn around. He just watched the red taillights bleeding on the wet asphalt, 40 stories below. "I drink whatever takes the edge off," Riley replied. Her throat felt raw. Dominic finally turned. He walked to the table, picking up one of the glasses. He didn't hand it to her. He just slid it across the smooth concrete until it stopped inches from her hand. The ice cracked sharply, a violent little pop in the silence. "You're shaking," he observed, his dark eyes tracking the microscopic tremor in her fingers as she finally reached for the glass. "Adrenaline," she said defensively, bringing the glass to her lips. The bourbon burned. It was a hot, aggressive trail of fire straight down to her stomach, settling there like a hot coal. She welcomed it. It grounded her. "Guilt?" Dominic asked. He took a slow sip of his own drink, watching her over the rim of the crystal. Riley let out a short, cynical breath. She leaned her hip against the edge of the table, crossing her arms to suppress the shaking. "That's the problem. There isn't any. I keep waiting for the morality to kick in. I keep waiting to feel sick about what I just did to that guy. But all I can think about is how easily he went down. All I can think about is that he tried to pull a gun on us and I stopped him. I liked it." The confession hung in the air, heavy and toxic. She had expected Dominic to smile, to look triumphant. He had corrupted her. He had won. But he didn't smile. The calculating, arrogant mask he wore in front of his men was gone. He set his glass down and closed the distance between them. He stopped less than a foot away. The sharp scent of cedar rain and expensive alcohol washed over her, making her pulse spike for an entirely different reason. "You think this is corruption?" Dominic said, quietly, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency. "You think I dragged you down into the dirt?" "Didn't you?" Riley challenged, tipping her chin up, refusing to back away from his proximity. Dominic reached out. Riley's muscles instantly coiled, expecting a strike, a grab, some show of force. But his hand moved slowly. His knuckles brushed against the side of her neck, his thumb grazing the edge of a dark, ugly bruise peeking out from the collar of her blouse. His touch was rough, calloused, and shockingly warm. "You were born in the dirt, Riley," Dominic murmured, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "Just like I was. The world spent 26 years telling you to keep your head down, to take the hits, to serve the coffee and clean up the blood. All I did was hand you a knife and tell you that you're allowed to cut back." Riley's breath caught in her throat. The absolute truth of his words hit her harder than any physical blow ever could. He wasn't a savior. He was a monster. But he was the only monster who looked at her and saw an equal rather than prey. "I'm not one of your soldiers," Riley whispered, her voice trembling slightly, the heat of his hand sending a dangerous, illicit thrill straight down her spine. "Don't mistake me for something you own." Dominic's hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the short hairs at her nape. The grip was firm, grounding, but not restrictive. "I don't want a soldier." He breathed, the distance between them practically erased. "I want a partner. Someone who doesn't flinch when the lights go out." Riley looked at the bruises on his jaw, the hard, unforgiving lines of his face, and the absolute darkness in his eyes. The waitress who scrubbed Formica tables was dead. She died the second she shattered that coffee pot. What was left was something sharper, colder, and far more dangerous. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, the ice in her veins melting into something volatile and hot. "Then leave the lights out," she said. That's where we leave Riley and Dominic for now, standing on the edge of a very dark, very dangerous precipice. Did Riley make the right choice by embracing the chaos? Or did she just trade one prison for a much deadlier one? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you loved this gritty raw, dive into the underworld where the heroine fights just as hard as the mafia. Boss, smash that like button and share this video with a fellow romance reader. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you never miss another dark storytelling session. See you in the next one.